Colin, what's on your radar?
Since the beginning of the year, 14 states have enacted 22 new voter laws, and that's just the start. 31 other bills are making their way through 18 separate state legislatures right now. Here are some quick highlights. 32 bills would make it harder to vote by mail. 14 bills would make it easier to kick people off of voter rolls. In Georgia, Iowa, and other places, they want to reduce the ability to vote early and reduce the hours polling places can stay open. The bottom line here is that these bills will make it harder to actually vote for anyone, period. But why? In many cases, these laws are written by Republicans in Republican-led legislatures, and it's likely that many of these restrictions would make it easier for Republicans to win elections. But let's not jump into our partisan corners here just yet. Let's take a larger view. In 2020, we saw record turnout amongst Republicans and Democrats, the highest voter turnout rate amongst eligible citizens since 1900, in fact. Nearly two-thirds of eligible voters actually voted in the presidential race. Of that two-thirds, 158 million in total votes cast, 69% voted by mail or early, according to the Census Bureau. You don't have to be a political scientist, a data analyst, or even a political person at all to know that inevitably, any of the bills we just mentioned that make it harder for 69% of people to vote the way they did will have one result. Less people will. And that's a problem that's bigger than parties. It's no secret that many people are frustrated with elected officials for one primary reason. They feel completely forgotten and disconnected from their government. Many feel their voice and their votes, in the end, don't actually matter because they're not part of a small group of well-connected political insiders, big money donors, or special interests. Average voters don't have lobbyists. Average voters don't spend their days in the halls of government or mingling with elected officials at swanky cocktail hours. And average voters are not part of the small group of 16,000 individuals responsible for more than 50% of the donations to congressional candidates. Most voters have one lever of power, their actual vote. So while the argument over new voter restriction laws is fractured right now along partisan lines as talking heads push us into those corners, what if for a moment we take partisan politics out of it and look at it this way? If more people vote of any party, and ideally both, it forces our politicians to be less responsive to the big money interests that presently dominate our politics, less responsive to what legacy media says or doesn't say, and in the end, be more responsive to us. And as voters of both parties share the primary concern that our government just isn't listening, what we should all be doing is fighting to create a system that makes it easier to vote, not harder. Making politicians fight for more of our votes is how we actually get them to pay more attention to us. It's how we actually fight back against a system that is increasingly rigged against us. We, of all parties, or none at all, should wholeheartedly reject any laws that make it harder to vote. We should want more people voting, not less. And we should be very suspect of any politicians who try to sell us these laws because they will benefit our political team. In the end, all it really means is that they have to pay less attention, and only to some of us, which means inevitably they'll pay less attention to all of us. Robbie, what do you think? I mean, there's new voter restriction laws being passed all across the country, mainly by Republican legislatures, but beyond the partisan politics of it, like in many states, Republicans actually voted, these ways. For instance, I'm from Florida. In the state of Florida, mail-in voting is kind of pretty even between Republicans and Democrats historically. 2020 was a little different. And early voting, is about the same as well. So what's behind this, and why should we be concerned if you think we should be?
Yeah, I mean, look, you raise a number of good points. With the exception, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to require people to show ID to vote. Obviously, a lot of these efforts, voter ID laws or everything, are yes, it's political, right? One side wants to get an advantage. Actually, Democrats do it too, right? They want to schedule the school board elections in off times where all the teachers are off and nobody else is paying attention to an election, right? There's a long history of this kind of going on both sides. But I agree, right now the right is very animated about maybe using this as a potential to fix whatever they think went wrong last time. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell your voters, don't vote by mail, you can't trust it, whatever, well, then obviously they're not going to. So then it's not a surprise when people don't choose that option. So it's an example of the right kind of creating a problem for itself. I think it has this problem with immigrant voters. It says we're going to be so hostile to immigrants, many of them who actually might be naturally socially conservative, hardworking, anti-socialist.
Sure.
And then the reality is they go to the Democrats when those were winnable people.
Yeah, no, look, I agree. And I've often wondered, if... Okay, so look, correcting what happened in 2020 has often been kind of a confusing thing for me. Because, yes, Republicans did lose the presidential race. It wasn't by that much. But they won everything else.
Yeah.
They basically won everything else. So why do you want to fix something that's not broken? Just get a better presidential candidate, And then maybe you'll correct that program. But I think inhibiting and making it harder for people to vote actually, while, yes, may help a certain party win in some of these elections, puts all people eventually at a disadvantage. It kind of starts to break down the system of democracy and one person, one vote, if outside of the voter ID laws, which we can have a separate conversation about, and even a separate segment about, not allowing people to vote by mail or vote early or limiting the number of polling places or the hours polling places stay open just seems counterproductive in the long term. And I almost feel like nobody's discussing it from that way, right? It's all, yes, Republicans are going to win more, Democrats are going to win more with this, instead of just saying, hey, if less people vote, politicians don't actually have to pay attention to us anymore. They can continue to do what they're doing, pay more attention to lobbyists, more attention to big money donors and special interests and people that run huge super PACs, et cetera, instead of paying attention to us. And that's really, in my opinion, part of the breakdown of the system here and why people are so polarized.
Yeah. I mean, if people knew to actually call your congressman, that spooks them more than even your vote can accomplish. The only other thing I'll say about that is I think there's a lot of complaining about the structures of how democracy works on both sides. I mean, there are liberals, Democrats who want to abolish the Senate and the Electoral College because they perceive correctly that there is now currently an unfair advantage built in that helps Republicans. But the system wasn't designed that way. Democrats just all decided to live in big cities in a couple places, so it's just what naturally occurred. Our system was not designed for that. Right. So I see how you don't like the way it is, but it's just you kind of have to win elections as they are, right? You have to convince your voters to move to Wyoming or something if you want to win election. That's not a crazy strategy. Or purchase newspapers, establish alternative media regimes, do something to get your message out. There's a lot of no, we can't win unless we change every fundamental aspect of our government that I think is also self-defeatist on the left.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would love to actually see some incentive programs to say, hey, move to Wyoming because we want to make it more Democratic or more Republican or whatever. And here are the benefits that you get out of doing that. That would be a very interesting long-term strategy that would be probably more egalitarian than very hard partisan gerrymandering, which I also think doesn't help anybody in the end anyways, whether you win more or lose more. Very interesting. Robbie, looking forward to what's on your radar next.